In a grand luxury hotel, the air was filled with elegance, wealth, and silence, except for one sound that refused to stop: the cries of a billionaire's baby. No nanny, no expert, and no amount of money could bring peace until a humble cleaning lady stepped forward and did the unthinkable. The lobby of the hotel was buzzing with quiet admiration as Richard Hayes, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, stepped through the glass doors carrying a baby in his arms. Guests whispered his name as he moved toward the elevator, his tailored suit pressed to perfection, his shoes shining, his assistant Olivia trailing behind with a small entourage of staff hauling luggage. But for all the grandeur, there was one thing money could not silence: the restless cries of baby Amelia, his infant daughter, who wailed against his chest without pause. By the time Richard reached the penthouse, the sound of her sobs had already begun to echo down the gilded hallways of the hotel, a piercing cry that unsettled even the most patient of ears. The penthouse was outfitted with every luxury imaginable: silk curtains, chandeliers, plush carpets imported from Europe. But none of it mattered when Amelia's cries rang through the night. Richard paced back and forth across the suite, his arms stiff, his movements clumsy, as though the child in his care was not his own flesh and blood but a stranger he didn't know how to comfort. Despite hiring top-of-the-line nannies and surrounding himself with every new gadget designed to soothe infants, nothing worked. Amelia's cries grew louder with every hour, her tiny fists balled tightly, her face red from exhaustion. Richard's wealth, which had solved every problem he'd ever encountered in business, seemed useless in the face of his daughter's unrelenting grief. "Behind the closed doors," the staff whispered. They spoke of how Richard Hayes, a man with influence spanning industries and empires, seemed clueless when it came to something as simple as holding his own child. Olivia, his assistant, was growing increasingly impatient. She insisted on flying in specialists, sleep consultants, childcare experts, even a private doctor, but Amelia's sobs drowned out their strategies. Olivia's voice, sharp and businesslike, cut through the air as she reminded Richard of his upcoming meetings, trying to disguise her irritation at the constant interruptions. For her, the baby was a problem to be solved quickly so life could return to schedules and deadlines. But Amelia was no business transaction, and no amount of planning could silence her cries. It was late one evening when Maria Johnson, the hotel's cleaning lady, first paused outside the penthouse doors. She had been assigned the top floor for the night shift, and while vacuuming the suite next door, she heard the wails of the baby carrying through the walls. Maria, a woman who had worked in hotels for most of her life, was used to overhearing arguments, music, and laughter, but there was something about this sound that pierced her heart. It was raw, desperate, the cry of a baby who was longing for something more than luxury. She slowed her work, her hands tightening on the handle of the vacuum, her instincts pulling her toward the door. The following nights, the pattern continued. The cries began as the evening fell and stretched into the early hours of the morning. Maria noticed Richard pacing the hallways, his tie loosened, his eyes heavy with fatigue, his daughter wailing against his shoulder. He was a man who seemed larger than life during the day, speaking in clipped commands and signing contracts that moved millions of dollars, but at night he looked like any other parent, overwhelmed, exhausted, and perhaps even a little broken. Yet, even as his face revealed the weight of sleepless nights, there was a pride in his posture that kept him from asking for help. He carried himself as though admitting weakness was worse than the endless cries themselves. Other guests were less forgiving. Complaints began to roll into the front desk. The noise disturbed their rest, and whispers of dissatisfaction trickled down to George Miller, the hotel manager. George was a man who valued appearances above all else, the kind who polished the lobby marble twice daily and scolded staff for the smallest imperfections. He despised disruptions, and a crying baby in the penthouse suite was the kind of scandal he feared most. Approaching Richard with forced politeness, he hinted that the child's cries were disturbing the elite clientele, his tone carrying the underlying message that something needed to change. Richard, already stretched thin by sleepless nights, bristled at the suggestion. His voice grew cold as he reminded George who he was and how much money he was paying for the penthouse. Yet, even as he dismissed the manager, The truth lingered in the air. Money could not buy peace, and Amelia's cries showed no signs of stopping. The staff continued to whisper. The guests continued to complain, and Richard continued to pace the golden halls of the hotel, his patience dwindling. And through it all, Maria Johnson, the quiet cleaning lady with kind eyes and a heavy past, listened from the shadows, sensing that something deeper was unfolding within those cries. A story that was not about wealth or status, but about a father who had yet to find his way to his own child. The night Amelia's cries reached their worst, Richard Hayes's patience finally snapped. He stood in the middle of the penthouse suite, his voice raised, demanding answers from the staff who lingered at the edges of the room. Olivia tried to soothe him with calm, rehearsed words, insisting they would call yet another expert in the morning. But Richard's temper was already beyond repair. His eyes were bloodshot from nights without sleep, his jaw tight with frustration as his daughter's sobs echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He accused the staff of incompetence, accused the doctors of being useless, and for the first time, the polished exterior of the billionaire cracked wide open. His voice carried through the hall like a storm breaking, and yet Amelia's cries drowned it all out. Relentless and heartbreaking, Maria Johnson, who had been quietly dusting the hallway wall sconces, stepped closer. Her eyes softened at the sight of the exhausted man and the inconsolable child in his arms. She didn't speak right away, but when Richard's anger burned out into silence, she approached gently, her voice low and steady. She asked if she could hold the baby, just for a little while to give him a moment to breathe. Richard turned to her with disbelief, his pride wounded, his face hard with suspicion. A cleaning lady? How could someone with no medical training succeed where professionals had failed? His first instinct was to dismiss her, to wave her off as just another distraction. But the cries in his arms grew louder, and his own body trembled with fatigue. For a brief second, his guard faltered and Maria extended her arms. With hesitation, he handed Amelia over, almost as if surrendering a battle he had fought too long. Maria cradled the baby against her chest with practiced ease, her movements slow, natural, filled with a tenderness that made the room grow still. She began to hum, a soft lullaby from her childhood, a melody no one in the room recognized, but one that carried warmth like sunlight spilling into a cold space. She rocked Amelia gently, swaying side to side, her hand supporting the small back with care. The change was almost instant. Amelia's cries hiccuped, then softened, and within minutes she quieted completely, her little fists unclenching as she nestled into Maria's shirt. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt holy. Richard stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The baby, who had kept him awake for nights, who had defied every solution, had surrendered her tears in the arms of a woman society would overlook. Amelia's tiny face pressed against Maria's chest, her breaths evening out into sleep, while Maria continued to hum, her eyes closed as though she, too, found comfort in the moment. Richard's astonishment turned to something deeper, an ache in his chest. Part grief, part relief, as he realized how far removed he was from this simple, necessary act of love. Maria eventually looked up and in her quiet way explained. Years ago, she had lost a child of her own. Her baby had been born too soon, her life too fragile to hold on. The wound never healed, and though she smiled for the world, the emptiness had remained in her heart. Holding Amelia now was both painful and healing. It reminded her of what she had lost, but also gave her the chance to pour out love she had kept buried for years. Richard's stern expression softened as he listened. For the first time, he saw not a cleaner in a uniform, but a woman whose heart carried scars and strength he could not begin to measure. Their fragile connection was quickly interrupted when George Miller stormed in, his face tight with disapproval. He scolded Maria, his voice sharp as he accused her of overstepping her duties. He reminded her she was hired to clean, not to interfere in the affairs of elite guests. His words cut through the quiet like knives, and Maria lowered her eyes, ready to be dismissed. But Richard's voice rang out before she could respond. Cold and commanding, he silenced George with a single look. He reminded the manager that it was his child's peace that mattered, and at that moment Maria was the only one who had delivered it. For once, Richard's gratitude outweighed his pride. He told George to leave, making it clear that Maria had his permission to help. Olivia, standing in the corner, watched with thinly veiled disapproval. Her lips pressed into a hard line as she tried to hide her annoyance. In her eyes, the scene looked unprofessional, even dangerous for Richard's image. A billionaire relying on a cleaning lady? It clashed with everything she thought he should represent. But Richard ignored her, his gaze fixed on Maria and his sleeping daughter. A subtle bond was forming in that moment, fragile yet undeniable. Maria had done what no one else could. She had given Amelia peace, and in doing so, she had reminded Richard of something he had long forgotten: the power of human connection, the kind that no amount of wealth could ever buy. As the days passed in the Grand Hotel, Richard Hayes found himself looking for Maria more often than he ever expected. At first, he told himself it was simply practical. After all, Amelia calmed in her presence, and Richard desperately needed the rest. But slowly, without even realizing it, he began to rely on Maria's quiet guidance. Each evening she would stop by the suite, sometimes under the pretense of tidying up, but always with a watchful eye on Amelia. She showed Richard how to hold his daughter not stiffly, as though afraid of breaking her, but gently, with a firmness that made the child feel secure. She guided his clumsy hands when preparing Amelia's bottle, corrected his posture when he rocked her, and reminded him to whisper softly so Amelia could hear the comfort of her father's voice. These were small lessons, but to Richard, they felt monumental. Things no nanny or consultant had ever explained. Things his late wife would have shown him, if only she were still alive. One evening, long after Amelia had drifted off in her crib, Richard and Maria sat in the dim light of the suite, speaking in voices softened by fatigue. It was in that moment Richard allowed the wall around his heart to crumble. He confessed what he had carried silently for months, that his wife Claire had died giving birth to Amelia. The memory of her final moments haunted him every night. He admitted he felt unworthy to be a father, as though he had stolen his daughter's mother from her. His voice broke as he said he feared Amelia would grow up seeing only his failures. Maria listened without judgment, her eyes heavy with compassion. She reminded him that love, not wealth, defines a parent. She told him that Amelia didn't need a perfect man, only a present one. Her words settled in Richard's chest like a seed, small but powerful, offering hope where there had only been guilt. Not everyone approved of the growing bond. Olivia watched the situation with mounting concern. To her, it was improper, even scandalous, that a billionaire of Richard's stature should lean on a hotel cleaner. She pulled him aside one afternoon, her tone sharp and businesslike, warning him that appearances mattered. "People talk," she whispered, implying that his reputation could be tarnished by something as simple as trust in the wrong person. Richard brushed off her warning, but the seeds of tension were planted. Olivia's loyalty was tied to his empire, not his heart, and she could not understand why he was letting sentiment cloud his decisions. George Miller, the manager, was far less subtle. Bitter about being silenced during their last encounter, he began keeping watch on Maria, documenting her every interaction with the Hayes suite. He reported her to upper management, accusing her of neglecting her duties and overstepping boundaries with guests. His words dripped with disdain, painting her as opportunistic, as though she had manipulated her way into Richard's trust. Maria, though shaken, held her ground. She had nothing to gain from helping Amelia, only something to give, a piece of her heart that had long been searching for purpose. The breaking point came during a formal board dinner hosted in the hotel's private dining room. Richard had reluctantly agreed to attend, bringing Amelia along because he refused to leave her with strangers. As glasses clinked and polished conversations filled the air, Amelia began to cry. At first it was a whimper, but soon it grew into the familiar wail that Richard dreaded. Guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, whispering criticisms. Olivia tried to take Amelia, bouncing her awkwardly, but the baby's cries only grew louder. The expensive childcare experts Richard had flown in circled around, each offering advice, each failing in turn. The room grew tense. The elegant dinner threatened to collapse under the weight of an infant's despair. Then the door opened, and Maria appeared. She had been on duty nearby, her heart tightening when she heard the cries echo through the hallway. Without hesitation, she walked into the glittering room filled with executives and investors, her uniform stark against their silk gowns and tailored suits. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she approached the crying baby, but Maria ignored them all. She lifted Amelia gently into her arms, but instead of calming her as she usually did, she did something far more daring. She turned to Richard and, with quiet strength, placed the child directly into his arms. Richard froze, startled by the boldness of the act. All eyes were on him as Maria stepped back, her gaze urging him forward. Amelia's cries softened the moment her father truly held her, not with stiffness or hesitation, but with the warmth Maria had taught him. His hands cradled her head, his chest pressed close, his voice breaking as he whispered his daughter's name. And then, before the stunned audience, Amelia quieted completely, her small hand grasping the fabric of his suit, her breathing steady as she nestled against her father's heart. The silence that followed was absolute. Every guest, every executive, every whisper of doubt faded into awe as they witnessed the unthinkable truth. Amelia did not need experts, nor wealth, nor strangers. She needed her father. Richard's eyes burned with unshed tears as he looked down at his daughter, a revelation dawning on him that shook him to his core. The entire room, once filled with judgment, was left speechless, stunned by the simple yet profound bond unfolding before them. And standing at the edge, Maria watched with quiet pride, knowing that sometimes the bravest act of love was stepping aside so a father could find his place in his child's heart. The dining room had fallen silent after Amelia quieted in her father's arms, but the true transformation began in the days that followed. Richard Hayes, a man who once believed every problem could be solved with wealth and expertise, finally saw what Maria had been teaching him all along. His daughter had never needed gadgets, nannies, or doctors flown in on private jets. She had needed him, his warmth, his touch, his presence. For the first time since his wife's death, Richard allowed himself to truly step into fatherhood. Each day, he spent less time hiding behind schedules and business calls, and more time learning to read the tiny signals Amelia gave him. When she was hungry, when she was tired, when she only wanted the comfort of her father's arms. The change was not immediate, but it was steady, and with Maria's patient guidance, Richard became the man his daughter had always needed. Of course, such a transformation did not come without conflict. George Miller, the hotel manager, continued to sneer at Maria's involvement. He dismissed her presence as inappropriate, a breach of professionalism that would tarnish the hotel's reputation. But Richard, no longer blind to true compassion, confronted him directly. In a quiet but commanding voice, he reminded George that leadership was not measured by appearances, but by humanity. When George muttered once more about the image of the hotel, Richard made his decision. In front of stunned staff, he dismissed George from his position, declaring there was no place in his world for men who treated people as expendable. The hotel, once ruled by George's cold grip, breathed easier in the days that followed. Olivia, too, found herself exposed. Her clipped remarks and sharp warnings about reputation had not gone unnoticed by Richard. Where she once thought she was protecting him, Richard now saw clearly that her loyalty was not to his family, but to the empire she thought she was preserving. He did not fire her outright, but he reassigned her to another branch of his company, far from his personal life. It was a demotion disguised as a transfer, and Olivia accepted it with thin-lipped silence. She had underestimated her employer's heart, assuming business would always triumph over love. She was wrong. Richard's focus now turned to Maria. One evening, after Amelia had drifted into a peaceful sleep, Richard invited Maria to sit with him. The lights in the suite glowed softly, and for once there was no tension in the air. With a sincerity that surprised even himself, Richard told her he could no longer see her as just hotel staff. She had become more than a helper. She was a source of strength, a guiding hand, and, most importantly, a bridge between him and his daughter. He offered her a permanent role, not as a maid, but as Amelia's nanny and godmother figure. His voice caught as he explained that he wanted Amelia to grow up with Maria's love in her life, not just his. Maria's eyes welled with tears. For so long, she had carried the silent grief of losing her own child, a wound that had never fully healed. Caring for Amelia had awakened both pain and joy within her, and now this offer felt like a second chance, a way to mother again, not through replacement, but through love. She accepted with a trembling smile, her heart overflowing with gratitude. For once, her life felt like it had meaning beyond endless cleaning shifts and overlooked labor. Amelia, with her tiny fingers and innocent eyes, had given her purpose once more. Months passed, and the change in Richard was undeniable. No longer was he the distant billionaire who barked orders and drowned in his grief. He became a father who could stand in a boardroom making million-dollar decisions by day and still be home in time for bedtime stories at night. The balance that once seemed impossible became natural because his priorities had shifted. Wealth was still part of his life, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the bond he shared with his daughter, a bond nurtured by Maria's wisdom and patience. Amelia blossomed under this new love. Her cries grew fewer, her laughter brighter. She clung to Richard with joy, her giggles echoing down the same halls that once carried only her wails. Guests who had once complained now smiled when they saw her, charmed by her warmth. Maria, too, became part of the family, not in name, but in spirit. She joined Richard and Amelia for dinners, accompanied them on quiet walks, and was present for every small milestone, the first word, the first steps, the first true smile that belonged only to her father. Richard himself found healing in ways he never expected. The guilt he had carried over Claire's death no longer consumed him. He spoke to Amelia about her mother often, telling her stories of Claire's kindness and strength, making sure she would always know who she came from. But now, when he thought of Claire, he did not only feel sorrow. He felt gratitude for the gift she had left behind and determination to honor her by raising Amelia with all the love he had once feared he could not give. The man who once seemed untouchable, by emotion had become a figure of compassion. He discovered that true wealth was not measured in contracts or properties, but in moments. Quiet mornings feeding Amelia, long evenings reading to her, and the steady presence of Maria who reminded him daily of what mattered most. The once broken man had finally found peace, not in power, but in love. And so the story closed with a simple truth. Sometimes the richest lessons in life do not come from wealth, but from compassion. And sometimes the unthinkable act is simply love.